Good evening. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our monthly live stream Q&A. Kelly and I are now, every month, we do a once per month, we do this Q&A with questions that have been sent to us from our Patreon supporters. This month's theme, we are looking at a campaign planning workshop. So we have gathered about 35, I think probably 30 different ones, because we had a couple duplicates, questions from our Patreon supporters that we're going to be going through over the next 2 hours or so. Answering them and discussing these ideas that relate to building and planning campaigns for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So looking at figuring out when your campaign is ready, crafting villains, involving character backstories, and then we've got a grab bag of a couple other ones. So we kind of took some time before the stream to organize all these questions and figure out which order we're going to put them in, so they're not in the order they've been submitted. And in a couple cases, we had questions that we thought were really, really similar, so we've tried to group them together, but we should be able to get to all of them. For those of you that are joining us in chat, if we have time at the end, we will take some more questions, but we would ask that you wait to submit your questions until the end. That way we don't miss them. If you ask a question in the midst, it might get lost in the shuffle of the chat. So please, if you do have any questions, especially if you got a burning question, please let us get through towards the end, probably in the last half hour of the stream or so, and we'll take it from there.
I will also say, once we do get to that section at the end, if you could type in all caps question before you write your question, it helps me pick them out from the chat amongst all of the other chat that is happening. So when we get to that, please use that to signify that you are asking a question. If you have not yet joined our Patreon, we do encourage you to do so, because then you get to take part in these Q&As, and you also get to take part in our writer's room, which happens monthly now as well, where on our Discord, which is exclusive for patrons, you can sit in and help Monty and I work on scripts for the coming month. So, come hang out. It'll be fun.
Yeah, and beyond that, Kelly and I also got all of our videos every week on YouTube. So we post new videos now on every Thursday and most Tuesdays. Actually, we've been having new stuff. We thought it was going to be every other Tuesday, but we've been getting stuff out there almost every Tuesday lately. So it's been pretty cool. This video, of course, for those of you watching after the fact, was recorded live, but will be up on YouTube as well. So I think we'll dive in, Kelly, yeah?
Yeah. To get started with this, so we're looking at campaign structure today. And for those of you who are fans of the Drakkenheim saga, you are well aware of Monty's creation of Drakkenheim. He is, I'm going to say, a majority of the creation of Drakkenheim. I contribute a little bit to that. I do have much experience running my own homebrew campaigns, as well as several of the pre-written modules. And we're going to be kind of discussing how both of us prepare for those things, how both of us kind of work our magic into creating and getting ready to run a brand new campaign, whether you're creating one yourself or running a pre-written one. Either way, there's work that needs to go into it. Right off the bat, the first section that we want to jump into is, when is the campaign ready? And we actually got several questions that are relatively similar. And so we want to make sure that we answer all of these questions. But I'll start off by saying that Rick W., Kate W., Rick B., several Ricks, Seth V., all of you had questions that kind of pertain to how much planning needs to be done before you start your campaign. And when do you know it's the right time to begin? And I'm going to open that up to Monty first, and then I'll contribute anything that I have as well.
Yeah, I've spoken with other dungeon masters, both through Dungeon Dudes and YouTube and online friends that spend years and years planning their campaigns and never actually play a game. And the reality of it is that even now, I never feel totally ready. And that's a totally normal part of it. Part of learning the ropes of dungeon mastering is how to cope with uncertainty and how to improvise on the spot, and especially pick up what your players are laying down and go with things in the moment. But I think that there's the process of learning how to plan a campaign is really about learning what you need as a dungeon master to be able to pick up things in the moment. So for myself, I know that I'm ready when I have a list of names, locations, and maybe monsters or problems that my players are going to be facing in the immediate short term. So one of the things most recently that I encountered with my own campaign planning was in our Shadows of Drakkenheim campaign. Our players are visiting the city of Dransmund, which I hadn't given a lot of thought to. Actually, even before this, we're going outside Drakkenheim and exploring other cities, and it only dawned on me about 3 weeks ago that Dransmund is the second largest city after Drakkenheim. It has a population of close to, it's like a Baldur's Gate Waterdeep level, size of city. Oh, that's really detailed and really big. And I remember going, oh no, what have I done? I just built Drakkenheim, and now I have to do this again. And really what it came down to was I just needed to, I just started making a list. A bullet point list of what are places that they're definitely going to go to. I need to know what's the main temple, what's the main, who's the ruler, what's the marketplace called, what's the dock called, and made a list of 10 important people in that city. And sometimes in inventing names, I often like to go with descriptive names that help me think of what the character is going to be like. And so when you choose evocative names for your NPCs, then you often have their personality trait built into that. And at that point, it was coming along. And then all I did was I was like, okay, I want Dransmund to be kind of like Hamburg in the 14th century. So I Googled a bunch of pictures of Hamburg in the 14th century and artwork of that, made a little portfolio of images so that I could pull a description out of my ass when I needed it. And that's what I had in front of me to run that part of that city. So lists and pictures are really good things. One of the things to not do is don't write something that looks like the official Dungeons and Dragons modules, because you need something that is organized for your brain, not something that is organized for a publication. And so for me, bullet points work really, really, really well. And really, at the end of the day, you only need to be one game session, if that, ahead of the players, because the players don't know what you have planned and what you haven't planned. And many times I made something up on the spot that people thought was a lot more developed than it actually was.
I actually remember, so I went over to Monty's last week, and he handed me the potential Edicts of Lumen from Drakkenheim, which I'm pretty sure were referenced heavily in season 1, but they didn't actually exist until we needed them to exist. And just to carry on with that point, or yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, and this is not a spoiler too much, but one of the biggest plot points of the Drakkenheim campaign is this meteor hit the city, and what is it, and where did it come from? And I basically ran the entire first campaign without knowing the answer to that question.
Yeah. He would have had to answer that if we'd actually went there, but
yeah. But the players never investigated it, so it didn't.
So it's just a mystery, yeah. And you can let things be mysteries, and I think this is important as well. Is Now, there is a skill involved here, and I'm going to say that this skill is something that Monty and I have learned, and I want to tell a little bit of a story here. So, when I first started D&D, I just, or specifically being a DM in D&D, um, I decided that right off the bat, I was going to run my own homebrew campaign. And I bit off more than I can chew. I hadn't even read a pre-written module yet, and I thought I was going to write my own campaign. And that was a bad choice. I needed to run some pre-written campaigns first to understand the flow of being a DM. And I also see specifically, I'm going to jump to Rick W's specific question here. How much planning should I do before I attempt to run a long campaign? Or should I try my hand first with just a short 2 or 3 session scenario set in the world I want to create and get my feet wet? And you answered your own question there. The answer, yes, you should run a short session to see how it goes, and don't even worry about anything outside of that. And that is the main thing that I learned is right now I'm writing my own homebrew world. And it's going to be a world-spanning campaign, much more in tune with Shadows of Drakkenheim than Dungeons of Drakkenheim. I'm writing a campaign where the players are going to be traveling across a bigger area, different regions. And I realized that all I really had to do to get ready to run this campaign was set up the city they started. So I set up the city they started, and I described that city in great detail. And I gave myself the 10 quests or so that were going to happen in that city. I have all the townsfolk that are going to be important NPCs, and I have what events lead to them leaving that city. Now, outside of that city, there's a whole world out there, but it's going to be months before my players actually get to that. So I've written out, like, okay, the next city over. I've written out point form. Here's the name of the city. Here's what the city's known for. Here's an ID on the quest. One of my ideas for a quest literally just says, this town has vampires in it. That's it. And when the players say, hey, do you guys want to head up to that city? Well, I already know that that city is about a 3 or 4 day journey from wherever they are. So I can write a traveling episode, which gives me 2 weeks to look at my point form notes, say, okay, I wrote out some prominent NPCs. There's vampires in this city. I have 1 sentence about what the vampires are up to. I'm going to wait until the players say they're going to go there, and then I'm going to figure out what the heck that is. So when you're getting ready to run a campaign, plan out the beginning, make notes on where you think the ending might be. But everything in between, point form notes is good enough. And like we said, lists and notes. You don't need to have everything mapped out, because also you might change your mind. And I ran into this a lot. The players might say something in a session that gives you a way better idea of what's coming. And so that vampire city, I might be like, you know what? Scrap the vampires. There's a beholder in this city now because the players mentioned a beholder, and that sounds cooler. And I can just mix things up whenever I want to. So don't tie yourself down when you're creating a campaign. Come up with the core concepts, the broad concepts, and fill it in as it happens. And that's my 2 cents on that.
And I think the other thing as well is there's when you're thinking about where is your campaign going to go, it is better to create problems than think about how those problems are going to be solved. It's your player's job to solve the problems. You just have to make them. And so you can do really big, terrible, strange problems that have a lot of causes behind them. For me, I was having a walk with my partner the other day, and we were talking about campaigns and D&D and stuff like that. And she was like saying, well, could you do a campaign inspired by arcane climate change? That's just this massive problem that has to be solved, like some magical anomaly that's like a metaphor for climate change. And that's your campaign. Cool. Yeah. And that's just a problem that the players have to deal with that isn't really easily solved, just like in the real world. And also, sometimes you can do a Another great campaign premise that is just a problem is a succession crisis. Who is going to be the next ruler of the realm? And sometimes I think I've seen some DMs that have run campaigns where like the succession crisis has a clear, this is the bad guy, this is the good guy, and you definitely want the good guy to be the one that gets the crown. But my preference in those situations is always, no, history isn't that kind at the time. It's always much more unclear. And so having it be a real crisis and letting the players' involvement actually determine how is that going to work out, and having all of those characters have their positives, their pros and cons, that could be really, really interesting rather than necessarily it being black and white. And so making problems that have a variety of ways that your players could approach them and let your players have that impact on the world is often, it's a great way to save yourself a lot of work and make your campaign more interesting in the process, because you're not going to be railroading your players because you're depending on them to determine what's going to happen next. The outcome is in no way predetermined. And because you're not planning the future, you're only planning what the world is like right now. It's a snapshot of where it is right now, not necessarily where it's going. And then you can figure out, and then at that point, you can role play your NPCs as if they were just player characters responding to the changing situations too.
The one thing that you'll hear us mention a lot when we're talking about our DM style is Monty and I are both excellent at improv, but not everybody is, and that is a skill that you need to kind of develop over time. When I started, I could not do the things I do now, where I've actually sat down with my players not knowing what I was going to run and just had a few point form notes. I remember actually once we sat down for a session and the players just decided to carouse. So we rolled on an advanced carousing table and I made a session out of it on the spot. But that's hard, and not everybody can do that. And for those of you who are not good at improv, just because you're planning broader and less and you are making stuff up as you go along, there's a difference between improv and knowing what you're good at and what you need to prepare. So you might be a DM who knows that if you have a dungeon map and a list of monsters, you can probably figure out where to put the encounters as the players go through that dungeon. Or maybe you need to prepare the dungeon fully ahead of time. But if they're arriving in town and you just write down a few points on the plot points, you don't need to write it the way, I think what I'm getting at is you don't need to write it the way a campaign module is written. Campaign modules are written in this weird way that are for anybody to pick up and read it like it's a story. But when you're the one running the game, you don't need to write a story. My DM notes look very different than a campaign. My DM notes will still be thorough.
Yeah.
And I'm not improving everything. My campaign notes, like if I pick up Rise of Tiamat and start reading that, it tells me we're arriving in Waterdeep, and here's what's going to happen in there, and here's the list of all the events and everything, and it gives it much more detail. Whereas mine just might be like Waterdeep. Here's the name of the tavern. Here's the name of the person who owns the tavern. Here's the quest that they're going to go on. They need to do this, this, and this. I'm going to guide them on that journey. And if I were to put that in a book, somebody else would read it and go, what do I do with this? But if you're the one writing the campaign, write what you need to write down to trigger your brain to say, right, in this session, we are doing X, Y, and Z. And I know enough to get my players from point A to point B, completing those tasks. And for each person, that's different. Yeah. So when is the campaign ready to go? When you know what it is that you need to write down to get your players on that journey.
Yeah, and on the opposite side, we had a couple questions asking later about like villains and stuff like that, and I just want to say that like the opposite way to do it is play a villain like a player character with a plan. You can play your villain. One of the ways that I like to play my villains is what would happen, what would the villain do if your player characters were not involved at all? If the player characters just never existed, what would that villain do? What would their modus operandi be? How would they run their business of villainy? And all of a sudden, if you go through the step-by-step steps of like your villain's evil plan and how long it's going to take them to succeed, then all of a sudden you actually have your campaign structure done, because now you know what your villain is doing. And one of the ways to then play that is your players encounter that, and all your villain is trying to do throughout the whole campaign is course correct. The villain has a plan. The villain's plan is going to work. And so if the players disrupt the villain's plan, the villain has to figure out how to bring it back on, like, to course correct, using whatever resources that they might have. It's really important if you're doing this that you don't have a villain that has infinite resources. You have to think about, why doesn't the villain just destroy the player characters right away and send a squad of teleporting assassins that invisibly kill the player characters in the night? You kind of have to figure out why your villain doesn't do that if they're super powerful. Because, you know, obviously some villains have that as a capability. So if the villains have a plan and you're just going to enact that plan, then make it work that way. And sometimes the onus now is on the players of like, hey, the villain is going to succeed on their plan in 60 days. If you don't come up with a way to stop them in 60 days, you lose. And then again, it's now on the players to figure out how the campaign proceeds.
So I think, okay, with that, I feel like that's is there any more that you want to talk about with how to know when the campaign is ready? I feel like,
yeah,
I feel like we answered that, but
I hope, like, we had some cool questions from Danny R and Bradley T about not defeating yourself during prep and brainstorming, and so I hope that this gives some cool ideas to mix it up. But I do want to come to Crush It's question here, which is, what are specific tools and methods that we each recommend for keeping your shit together? What tools and methods change when playing online or at the table? Both Kelly and I said point form notes and folders filled with cool images are like, and lists, point form notes, folders of images, lists of names are always going to save you. Maps as well. Include maps in the images, because just go online, there's tons of awesome map making Patreons and websites. Just start a folder on your computer where you collect images for NPCs, images for locations, and maps. And if you just go, you can go into those folders and it will be like a la carte finding all the stuff that you need. I use Scrivener as my digital Dungeon Master's notebook, and that works for me both online or at the table. It's an awesome scrapbooking application, but using another app like OneNote or Evernote can be really handy and is way better than having a bunch of folders on your computer of Word documents like Kelly does.
Yep. Don't mind that. I don't necessarily recommend it. It's just working for me right now, but I currently have folders inside of folders, but it is a map that I understand, and that's important. Is I have a folder on my computer named after my campaign, and in that folder there is a list of all of the areas that they can explore, and within each area I have a list of the different key locations, and in each key location is a note that has point form what's going to happen there. And when it comes to the images and maps, I again, like, I'll give another example from my campaign. Early on in the campaign, there is a mine full of trolls. So I have the name of the mine, and if I click on that folder, there's just a piece of a pages document there that says, in this mine, there are trolls. The boss troll's name is this. He has these things. They have been kidnapping villagers from the town nearby because they're hungry. And when the players decide to go there, I'm going to open up a different folder on my computer under maps, and I have a section called mines. And there's just maps of mines. And I'm going to pick one, and I'm going to open it up and go, all right, cool. I'm going to put the boss troll in this room. I'm going to put 2 trolls having a campfire in this room. I'm going to put a gelatinous cube over there, and that's the place that the trolls avoid. And now I have my dungeon. And
yeah,
then that's it.
And one of the other kind of hybrid methods that I do use that isn't in Scrivener or Evernote I use a lot of spreadsheets in Google Sheets and Excel. And I find that spreadsheets are really handy for making nested lists of many, many things. Like, so for example, when I was making my cities for Westamar, I made the list of cities, but then I had another title in the spreadsheet, which is the city name, who's the ruler, what are the key resources in the city, what was their allegiance in the Civil War, what's the symbol, what's the province, and like what is the key, like who was the previous ruler, who's the court mage, who's the high flame keeper. And so I ended up with a spreadsheet that actually was like an index of all the cities, their most important buildings, and their most important NPCs. And it's a one-page spreadsheet that is like a complete high-level overview to the most important cities in my campaign. And I can just pull that up and look at that. I'll also use spreadsheets for organizing monsters. One of the activities that I love doing is just going through the monster manual or going through the monster list in D&D Beyond and making lists of cool monsters that I haven't used in a while and grouping them together into like cool squads or war. Like, I almost kind of think of it as like building a war band of like, okay, so I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna get the Sahagwin, but I think I'm also gonna grab a bunch of sharks. And it'd be really cool if they had a Chul and an Umber Hulk with them. And of course, an Aboleth is leading them all. And then maybe there's like a crazy Mind Flayer that's helping them out as well. And here's like the 2 humans that they're working with as well. And like you kind of build this kind of like conspiracy flowchart of all the monsters and how they work together. And that actually is a really fun exercise for like building your evil organization. And then you can actually put numbers on it and say like, you know, the Mind Flayer has 30 Grimlocks. And then you can just break them up into squads to build your encounters as well.
This is actually, I fully agree with that. So with the campaign I'm writing, I will look at a new location, and before I even write anything, first, if it's a town or something, I'll write the available information about the town. But then same as Monty, my favorite thing is I'll go into the monster manual or just on D&D Beyond, look for a monster that I love, that I just love, pick it as like the boss monster for the area. Then think of all the monsters that might be relating to that. And now I set that aside and I go, okay, here's the town or city. Here's the group of monsters I want to use. Now let's come up with a point form story that ties this all together.
Yeah.
So then you have about a month worth of adventuring for your players to do.
Totally. If you just making lists of cool monsters and like one of the actually fun ways to not pad out your campaign and actually to keep the pacing nice is to not reuse monsters if you can avoid it. Like try using different monsters and finding different creatures that you can use and try to pick like set piece monsters, and it keeps things fresh and it helps you keeping new ideas. And sometimes it's just interesting enough to just say, yeah, in this encounter, especially because like entire campaigns where it's only humanoid monsters, it gets really, really hard to keep making a bunch like you can only have so many interesting combat encounters that are a bunch of bandits, right? Like there's without having to do a whole bunch of work to give all those bandits custom stats and like unique stuff. Whereas if instead of bandits you use Grimlocks or Murlocs or whatever you want to pull in, it instantly makes them more interesting because they're just not a bunch of guys with swords.
Here's another trick for all of you. If you are creating your own campaign, surprise secret for you, you do not have to run the monsters with the same lore that they have in the monster manual.
What? Are you gonna say that you can change their stats too?
Yeah.
You're telling me that I can use a monster in the monster manual and change its lore and change its stats? How dare you?
I'm sorry to bring this to you, Monty. It's a reality that we all have to face. But like, okay, let's say that we are making an Aboleth, but then we want a Mind Flayer there as well. I mean, there are certain mind flayers that maybe you could pick to, but anyway, the point is, you could pick two monsters that have nothing in common, tweak a few things about their backstory, tweak the way you describe it, and now they can work together.
Yeah.
Your mind flayers could be working for a mind flayer could be working for a gelatinous cube if you wanted. Who's to say they can't? I'm just making stuff up. That's probably a terrible idea.
What if the gelatinous cube is the brain goo residue of an elder brain?
Okay, and see, now we're
we cross an elder brain with a gelatinous cube, right? And like it's like a gelatinous brain. There.
So why the hell not? if you see a bunch of monsters that have nothing to do with each other, but you want to use them, then use them and just tweak a few things. And I bet, like, in your brain, you're going to come up with something fun.
Yeah.
And that's really another major point. Is just like, it's your world. Do whatever the heck you want. So yeah. I think. So that should give people a clear idea on like how Monty and I are prepared. Point form notes, lists, and folders full of maps, and you'll be ready to run the campaign. All you need to do is plan the beginning, which should last you like a month or so. Like, plan the first month of your campaign. Plan where you think it's going to end and what you think the prominent themes are, and then write point form notes working outwards from where you start. And you can start the campaign with only like a few ideas on the recently outwards things from your starting location. You don't need to have the whole thing mapped out. You're going to write that as you go.
Before we move on, a couple final just words of encouragement. The first campaign that both Kelly and I ran, they both collapsed. They did the first campaigns that we ran, but never got to the end. They collapsed. The second campaign I ran also collapsed. I didn't actually finish, and in fact, the first campaign that I actually had finished properly was my Age of Worms campaign, which I ran from Dungeon Magazine. So that was a pre-written campaign. And so I will say that for a new DM, using either an established campaign setting or an established adventure is really helpful to help you get used to D&D. And I would strongly caution a first-time dungeon master from planning a whole level 1 to 20 campaign their first time out the gate. Run a level 1 to 5 campaign, run Lost Mines of Foundelver, run Dragon of Icespire Peak, cut your teeth with something that gives you some support. There's actually really good value in learning from an established module, and then take it from there.
A lot of the established modules do require some finessing, but that is actually part of the benefit of running them, is that you start to fill in the gaps, you start to learn things. And like Monty said, my first campaign was a pirate campaign that Monty actually played in.
And I loved it. It
was great, but it was too big.
Yeah.
And I had notes for days. I was trying to plan everything, and it was before I understood that planning everything was a bad idea. And so it crumbled. It crumbled horribly. And I had to just tell my party, like, it was me. It wasn't even them. It was one of those rare occurrences where it wasn't the party who like couldn't make it to games anymore. It was me being like, guys, I can't even handle my own campaign world right now. I don't know what's going on in it. I need to run a pre-written module. And so I ran Lost Mines of Phandelver, followed by the Tyranny of Dragons. And Tyranny of Dragons, for all of its flaws, taught me so much about running a campaign, running chapters, running players through adventures. I even added chapters in because of player choices, which taught me even more. And now, after running that and Out of the Abyss, I feel like I'm ready to try writing a campaign again. And so I'm jumping into it again. And it makes so much more sense this time around.
Yeah. And it also will help you manage things that are actually, I think, more essential, like running encounters and working with your players. And that's where like some of our next questions actually are, how do you, Patrick M, Matt M, and Tiny Talking Tina and Peter J. and Wolfie all asked about, in general, how do you get players interested and invested in the world? How do you handle their backstories? And how much intervention from the Dungeon Master is too much in the player characters' backstories? And how do you get them involved in the setting? How do we do this, and how do we establish this? And I think that this is something that Kelly and I have worked on a lot in our games. And I think we have some fun things to say about how to handle this and how to present this to the players.
Yeah, so first and foremost, if you're a DM and you're writing your own campaign and you want the players to be important, and you should want the players to be important, that's the whole point. And there's something beautiful that you get to do when you're writing your own campaign that actually is a lot harder in a pre-written campaign, and that is tying the players into the story on a very deep level. Now, this doesn't need to be complicated. If you ask the players to all write a backstory, but when they're writing the backstory, you should let them know up front, write me a draft of your backstory and we will revise it together. And that's the important part. And the revising together is pretty simple, actually. What you're going to look for is in your player's backstory, look for key elements that they might mention that if you were to just tweak them slightly, maybe change a name or change a location, then you suddenly can make it part of the world that you've already created. If a player says, well, I fled after a great war and wound up living in the barn of a dwarf, and then your DM comes at you and says, well, what if that dwarf, instead of a dwarf's barn, what if it was just the other player's barn? Now suddenly you've tied two of the players together.
Yeah.
If in your backstory you say, I worship at a church in a great land on top of a mountain called this or that, and your DM says, actually, I have a city on top of a mountain that has a great church. Here's the name of it, and here's some lore about it. Does that work? Then suddenly you're making these bridges between the campaign that you've already started structuring and your character's backstory. And all you have to do is find common ground where your player says, oh yeah, I can change that. And then suddenly Mount this or that is, the mountain that is in the actual campaign. The church worships an actual thing that's been written in the campaign, and now that player character is tied in a way there. And you also want to look for, as a final point before I hand it over to Monty, what does your player want out of the campaign? What is their character's goal? And how can you tie that to one of the main elements of the campaign?
Yeah.
And by creating those bridges to other players, bridges to key NPCs and locations that already exist, and ties from what the players want to accomplish with their character to what the theme and setting and goal of the campaign is going to be. That's all you have to do. That sounds like a lot, but really, I handed Monty my backstory for Wilhelm. And I don't want to give any spoilers here, but Monty basically, well, the one that I can give is I did have Wilhelm stayed in a dwarf's barn for years and learned from the dwarf. And Monty said, well, couldn't that just be Rudy? And I said, yeah, that makes way more sense. And then we can just scrap this boring section of my backstory and make it way more interesting.
Yeah. Building the connections between the player characters is the most important thing. Many of your favorite stories from fiction include characters that already know each other before the story begins, in some way, shape, or form, right? In Star Wars, C-3PO and R2-D2 had already been working together for years, and they both had a pre-existing relationship or connection to Princess Leia in some way, shape, or form. And so, Luke knew old Ben in some way. So those characters already have a certain sort of awareness of each other. Frodo and Gandalf knew each other for a very long time as well and had a pre-existing relationship and friendship before the story of The Lord of the Rings began. So, depending on where you start, you can establish these more strongly. I find for role-playing games, and D&D especially, the more connections you have between the player characters, the better job it does of kicking off that opening arc and explaining those things like, why are the player characters adventurers and why are they working together and what are their goals? And that natural thing of just telling, I say to my players, each of you needs to have a connection with at least one other player character in some way, shape, or form. For larger groups, you might even want to increase this to 2. other player characters. And then you can also do what Kelly said. I like to call this practicing economy of NPCs. Rather than create a new NPC, ask yourself, can I change an existing NPC to fit into the world in a existing way? With a great example of this from our own campaigns is with Joe's character, Wrath, wanting to have a family member. Well, I just was like, well, River can be your sister. And now we can figure out your whole family tree just by slotting you in here. And that made it work. And that made the whole thing make sense. And actually it made a lot of elements of Joe's character really, really great. I continue to have one-to-ones with my players in the campaign where just in this past week, I have had one-on-one chats with Kelly and Joe and Jill, where I sat down and said, so how are you enjoying your character? What are you looking forward to next? Where do you want to go with things? And we went back over their backstory and some of their character elements, and I gave them a couple ideas. And I said, I said to Jill, actually, it would be really cool if you could come up with like a list of 6 names that you could give me that I could drop in here and there, and I can use these to tie this in. And we started giving names to places. Again, these lists are really, really useful, right? And finding out what your players are excited about, then taking those things and making them, finding the things that you made and changing what you need to make those things the same thing. So this is how the way that you involve a player character's backstory is by taking the stuff that you made and taking the stuff that they made and smashing them together so that they become one thing. And yes, that means that sometimes you're going to have to compromise your vision for how those characters were going to be, and sometimes the players are going to have to compromise their vision too, but it will make it better. It will make it a lot better, and sometimes it makes it a lot more complicated in unexpected ways. But like Kelly and I had this amazing conversation when we were talking about Wilhelm the other week, and like I don't want to go into any of the spoilers of it, but like it felt like dominoes falling. Like we were like, how do we make this element of your character's backstory make sense? And like it was like we talked about these world building elements that we've been thinking about. We talked about some existing characters that were already established in the world, and it was just like,
yeah.
And it just all made sense. Now, the flip side of it is to do something completely crazy, which is what we did with Joe in the first campaign, where you just make up a whole region of the world that they can be from, and you just let them be in charge of that. I have like 10 notes about the Caspia, and everything else was Joe coming up with things for Paluto Jackson to do on the fly during the campaign. And sometimes you just give the player a region of the world that's on the other side of the world and just say, you can make up whatever you want with this, and we'll just roll with it.
It's made Caspia a little ridiculous, but we love it.
Yeah.
Monty, I actually have a question for you, because going off of that, some more great examples. For those of you who have watched season 1 Dungeons of Drakenheim, did Joe create Jupiter, or was that like a shared backstory concept?
So Joe's original character concept, he wanted to have a family member missing in the ruins, but Jill already had a family member missing in the ruins, so we really had to work on that, because I didn't want to have 2 people with family members missing in the ruins. For any of you that are running a Drakenheim campaign, family members missing in the ruins is something you really want to avoid because people die there. If your family member is missing in the ruins of Drakenheim, it's not going to turn out well for your character.
Yeah. But I know that like just an example is when I handed my backstory into Monty. If you guys have seen Dungeons of Drakenheim, River, Tobias Crow, Cat, Mouse, and even I want to say that there was a few others, were all from my backstory. And Monty did with them amazing things without giving spoilers. there were some great moments, but like I didn't know who those characters were going to be. I just knew that they were in my backstory, and I told Monty that I wanted them to be somewhere. The fact that River was the first person we ran into, and I just had her in my backstory as an old friend from mage school, and now she's become such a prominent quest giver in both campaigns, and now even become tied into Wrath, a new character in season 2, all from me just writing that there was a tiefling wizard sorcerer that I went to school with who was my closest friend during those years.
Yeah. And, you know, the other thing that actually really made it sing for us was that we had characters that had families who were alive and were willing to get involved in the adventure in an exciting way, right? When your player characters are not friendless, wandering orphans bent on revenge. Like I basically tell my players, like, it's okay if you're doing a first time campaign like this, but like nowadays when I'm running a campaign and a player comes to me with a character who is a friendless wandering orphan that just wants revenge, I just say, no, you just can't play that character. No, give me something else. But that's because I've done that a lot and I'm just done with it. There is a way to make that interesting. I just personally, it's like, I've eaten enough McDonald's in my life. I don't need to eat any more McDonald's. Nothing wrong with a Big Mac and I love burgers. I love chicken fingers, but if I never have another chicken McNugget again in my life, I will not regret that.
I mean, you literally saying this makes me want chicken McNuggets. So, you know, I'm going to probably get some when I'm done here. So there's that. But yeah, so to go back to the core element of this question, how do you handle backstories? How much DM background intervention is too much? How do you get your characters interested or invested? The short answer that we're kind of leaning on here is create bridges between what you've created and what your players created. Look for commonalities that can be shifted with a slight change to suit everybody's needs, and you've done it. Your characters are now more invested. You've done very little intervention. You've just told them to, oh, cool, could this NPC be this? Yes? Done. And you've got it. You've got enough that the characters are going to really care. They're going to really care.
Be open to revising anything. Don't get fixated. Like, anything is up for grabs. The more you let your players get involved, if you want your players to be more involved, you have to let them be more involved and be open to that in those changes and that malleability. And by doing this, you will instantly have a bunch of player characters that care about the world in a more interesting way. Now, of course, in general, this does take a couple. Once again, Kelly, Jill, Joe, and I have been playing together for years, right? And so that means that we know each other really well. We know what each other like about D&D really, really well. If you're playing with a new group, you may still need to get to know your players and have those conversations about what they like about D&D. Do those session 0 steps. Find out what their goals are, what excites them about the game, right? For us now, we know what excites them, and you know, even still myself, you know, I ask people point blank, like, what are you interested in? What are you interested in, right? When I was having my conversation with Joe, he's like, I love this. I love where we're going with Bruce the cat and his warlock patron, Bruce. And he's like, these are the things, like, these are the mysteries that excite me about Bruce. And I said, well, have you read this book? Or have you, I did some research about cats and mythology, and maybe we can pull on these things. And he's like, yeah, I'm really into that. And so if you don't know, you have to have the conversation and ask and find out what your players are going to get excited about. Because if you're guessing, and I don't think this harms the integrity of the game. There's a way to have these conversations, and usually the way to have these conversations is you as the dungeon master need to ask more questions and do more listening. And if you ask good questions, and ask your players, what are you excited about? What do you imagine happening? What do you think might happen next? What would be a cool thing for your character to do? Who are the important people in your character's life? Your players are going to give you stuff, and you should just listen and write down and start using those things. Whatever comes out of their mouths, those are the things that they're excited about. Those are the things that you need to use.
Yeah. So hopefully that helps all the people who asked us questions about player character backstory and how to weave that in. There's a lot there, but hopefully it's simple enough that like it is all about listening to what your players want and building bridges between what you've created and what they've created. To quickly answer a question in chat here, just because I can very quickly, yes, the name River did come from Firefly and Doctor Who. And those are two things that I love and adore. And so I love the name River from both of those, and that's where it came from.
Yeah. And it also eventually led to, we didn't know what River's last name was. And actually we one of the cool bits of lore that we arrived on is that in the world of Drakenheim, because the mages in the world of Drakenheim cannot inherit, and they give up their title and inheritance, they actually give up they can, if they want to, give up their names and give themselves a new name. And so they just choose a name, and sometimes they just go with River or Wrath, or sometimes they keep their names like Sebastian did. So this idea that they can have weird names actually was something that came out of just, why is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So moving on, we have a couple questions about villains in a campaign setting. We have a question from Gregory Russell and one from Robert Gregory. Should I just read both of these out and then we'll see what we can come up with, or one at a time?
Well, I like I want to talk about the second question first, which is Robert Gregory saying, at what point of a campaign should a BBEG or the plans and workings of the BBEG be introduced? And how do you go about that? When would you do that?
Well, okay. So I actually, here's a little backdrop for you guys. I have beef with a lot of the pre-written modules for not introducing the BBEG or their plans early enough. There are some pre-written modules where you don't hear about the villain until like the end of the campaign. But then how are your players supposed to hate them or care or want to fight against them? My general idea is that you don't want to give away the whole plot line. Leave room for twists. But your big bad evil guy should be a known presence, or one of their main lieutenants should be known within the first couple chapters of the campaign. And if you're not going to reveal it then, give a few hints that are going to lead to a big reveal, probably by the time the characters are like level 4 or 5. We actually, in the campaign that we ran before we started streaming, we did that whole introduction arc.
Yeah.
Where we were on our way to a wedding, and the party was actually a wedding party.
I want to jump in on this.
Okay.
Because here's the secret. This is when you introduce your villain. The moment your players care about something in the world, that is when you need to introduce your villain, and your villain needs to threaten that thing.
Which happened.
And that is actually that's actually a storytelling 101 thing, right? In storytelling 101, when you watch a movie or you read a book, the first job of that opening arc of the story, the first like 30 minutes of a movie or whatever, or the first chapter of a book, it has to make you care about the characters, the world, and the people in it. And as soon as you care, and as soon as you love those people, you have to tell the reader or the characters or the players, you know that thing you love about this world? It is going to be destroyed unless you do something. And bam, campaign done.
Yeah. So I want to go back to this. Monty was running Red Handed Doom before we started streaming, before Drakenheim, and Joe and I were playing in it. Joe was playing a bard. He was the groom. The rest of us were all the wedding party. We spent levels 1 through 5, the first probably 2-3 months of playing.
Yeah, it was about 12 sessions.
Yeah. And we were just going from town to town in the Ulster Vale. I had never read the Red Hand of Doom, and I didn't know Monty was going to run it. We were just going from town to town, getting to know every single town along the way. Monty even had us write in the backstory. He handed us a map of the Elser Vale, and he said, make your character from one of these towns and design a bar in the town that you are from. And we all submitted to Monty a backstory, where we were from. We were all from somewhere different along the Elser Vale. And we all created a bar and a few NPCs. Then levels 1 through 5 was us traveling from town to town, drinking at those bars, celebrating with the NPCs, and collecting wedding gifts and cakes and buying suits.
And there were little small problems. Like, yeah, you had to raid an old ruin for a treasure. There was one of the villages where you were going to get the wedding cake made, and the baker had been kidnapped by a crazy wizard, and so you had to save them and a bunch of the villagers. And like you went on a hunt. Like, I spent 12 game sessions making you guys love the world, making you guys fall in love with the Elser Vale, and also making you all feel like you were heroes, because you were just helping everybody out. Like, you guys cared a lot.
Yeah.
And then
what was great is even early on in that campaign, I remember we fought some goblins, and they had like a symbol with them. And I remember picking up that symbol, and every time we stopped in, we're like, have you ever seen this symbol before? And everybody was like, no. So we just had this thing. And then all of a sudden we get to the wedding day. Joe gets married. And then the Red Hand of Doom army shows up. And it's basically, we fought a bunch of scouts. One of our friend Josh's character dies. And all of a sudden we find out that symbol is the symbol of this army that is marching on the Elser Vale, and a doom clock appears. Monty slaps a doom clock in front of us and is like, in 2 weeks' time, this town will be destroyed. 2 weeks after it, this town will be destroyed, and they're going to go through until they destroy the entire Elser Vale. So 5 levels of building, and then bam, the main villain is now known to us. The threat is now known to us, but we cared so much. Man, that was a traumatizing campaign.
Yeah, and I will actually say, as an adventure structure, for those of you that are planning campaigns, spending levels 1 to 5 doing small quests and adventures, getting your players eased into the world, getting your players eased into the main ideas of the campaign world, and giving them some small victories, and in fact, letting them resolve some small elements of their own backstory, then introducing your big plot and your big villain, that will make them care. That will make them hate your villain. That will make them love the world. And it works. It's completely formulaic, but it works.
So yeah, with villains, introduce them, and introducing them also means that you don't have to meet them. I also remember Monty ran Rise of the Rune Lords, and something that you did to amplify that was you had the Rune Lord was able to manifest into statues of himself that were around the world.
Yep.
So rather than Monty presenting the Rune Lord in front of us, he had him appear in statues, kind of like in Drakkenheim, the way that the demon appeared in statues as well.
Yep.
Is like, you present these things to the players as a known threat, but something that they don't know where it is or how to get to it yet.
And I will also say, just so that DMs are aware of these, the spells Dream, Simulacrum, and Project Image are all designed so that your player characters can talk to the villains, potentially even attack them, without that villain truly being threatened. If you ever wonder, what is the purpose of the Project Image spell? The Project Image spell is so that the villain can show up in front of the players, taunt them maliciously, and then when the players inevitably stab the villain, it turned out to be an illusion. Your villain using the Simulacrum spell allows the villain to actually personally intervene into a situation and fight the players and get killed by the players without actually being killed. The Dream spell lets you taunt them in their dreams as well. So those spells are cool little tricks in your villain's arsenal that they can use. One of the other ideas that I've wanted to play around with is actually a villain who aggressively clones themselves and has like a really advanced cloning facility. And yeah, the players get to kill him over and over and over and over again, but he has tons of clones.
Got to check for the belly buttons,
Yeah.
So moving on to Gregory Russell's question, how would you best create and introduce a rival team that were later going to be villains? This one's tricky because Monty and I have actually played around with rival teams a few times, but in most cases, they actually ended up not becoming villains. Jupiter Jones is a prime example of a rival team. We had a rival adventuring party, but we ended up befriending them. And even in the Red Hand of Doom, I think Jupiter Jones was a variation on the character who I can't remember the name of from that you implemented in Red Hand of Doom, who was like another suitor for Joe's wife, who was like, you always pit them against Joe. Joe just always has a rival.
Joe does really well with having a rival. Yeah.
So if you are going to have a rival team that are later going to be the villains, that's tricky because you also don't want to implement them in a way where the party's just going to turn and kill them.
Yeah.
You need to build that up.
I personally think if you're going to introduce a rival team of adventurers, you got to be prepared for it to go either way. You got to be if you want them to later be villains, maybe you have to accept the possibility that maybe they'll be allies instead. Because I think that that's a little bit predeterministic, right? And make them with the possibility rather than the guarantee. If you want them to definitely be villains, then introduce them as villains.
I actually that does bring up a point about world building in general, and this applies to so many aspects of world building. Something that I've been learning while building my current world is I would write something like, I have an entire plot line about a group of bandits that are starting like a rise against the major cities. There's like a rise of this whole bandit community who is gathered under a single banner. And at first I wrote this entire plot line being like, these are the bad guys of the campaign. And then I started thinking about the way Monty ran Drakkenheim and started thinking of them as a faction instead of the villains. Because I thought, what if the players meet the bandits and say, you know what, screw civilization. Let's join the bandits and go to war against that people. Who am I to be like, well, now you're derailing my campaign? Well, no, like if the players decide to join the villains because like write every character with a reasonable thought process behind their actions, a reasonable enough thought process that you think you might be able to convince one of the players to say, oh man, that actually makes sense. And if you can do that, you also need to be open to the fact that all of your villains could become allies in the world that you're creating. If you do have somebody who's going to be a villain, then it's hard to say that they're going to be a rival team, because rivals is sport. Villain is something far worse.
Is war. Is war. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think like, I think that the thing is that the rival, it has to be organic, right? Like there is a way that rivals, like people who are, you think about people that compete in sports. Sometimes people that compete against each other in sports turn out being each other's best friends. Sometimes they become rivals, and sometimes their rivalries become enemies. So if you want that to be a possibility, what I would actually recommend is maybe introduce more than one rival team and have them with different traits. And then maybe one of the rival teams then what you can actually do is those two rival teams definitely don't like each other for whatever reason. But then the players decide who do they like better. And that the players throw that out of balance, and that's what drives one rival team to be villainous and one to be allies. And that can actually sometimes the way that you drive one thing in one direction or another is put the choice on your players. Is how do you make NPC X become a bad guy? Well, add NPC Y and Z and give them all conflicting opinions that are incompatible with each other. And then all of a sudden you're going to have somebody that gets pissed off. And as soon as you have somebody that gets pissed off at the players for something they did, then they can become a villain. That's all it takes for someone. Like, if the players wronged somebody, that, make a list. Where did the players make mistakes? Who did the players make angry? Those people can become villains. Who did the players let down? What if maybe one time the players save a village, but a bunch of people in that village didn't make it? Well, do the people in the village, do they harbor a grudge?
So, we've talked about when is the campaign ready. We've talked about player character backstory and villains. The next kind of big section here, we have a couple big questions about player choice. And I think this actually carries on very nicely with sort of the things we're talking about. Alexander F. writes, it's a pretty big question, but the main points that we've kind of pulled out of it are, how do I link these adventures together in a campaign without them feeling stilted? Should I have a BBG in mind, or can I let my players pursue certain goals without a central villain? And how do I do that without railroading them?
So one of the other things that Alexander asks in this longer question is that he is working with Lost Mines of Phandelver and several other adventures that he's pulled from the Dungeon Masters Guild and online and everything, and wants to kind of stitch them together. And my first piece of advice would actually go back to what we mentioned before, is practice economy of NPCs. What are the NPCs in these adventures that are kind of similar, and how do you delete them and make character X in Lost Mines of Phandelver and character Y in Horde of the Dragon Queen the same person? Just make them the same person.
It is really the same as the character backstory thing. It's just you're trying to create bridges. If you've read multiple adventures and you want to stitch them all together, look for commonalities. Anything that sounds remotely similar, and then just rewrite it to be the same.
Yeah. One of the things that you actually, Alexander suggested in his own question, is have all these problems caused by the same big bad evil guy. And that can be one interesting way to link it all together, is you have a uniting villain that all of the sub-villains of those individual adventures are all lieutenants for that main villain. And so you kind of just have to add an end game objective to each of those things of like, what was it? So
there's no reason why Glassstaff from Lost Mine of Phandelver can't be a member of the Cult of the Dragon Queen from the Rise of Tiamat.
Exactly. And as for how to do this without railroading them, by building those connections between these scenarios and relating to them together, the players will naturally go between those things. And maybe sometimes you just have to, toss the hook out a little bit, right? And use some of the backstory techniques that we talked about earlier to weave these in as well. Remember that railroading is when a dungeon master forces the player characters to take action in a specific way. Your campaign is you're not railroading your players because your campaign is linear. That is just, your campaign has a linear structure, and the players do X, then they do Y, then they do Z. They have to proceed with things in a linear order. It's only when railroading happens when there's a lake, and the players have to get from the town on this side of the lake to the town on that side of the lake, and the players say, well, we want to walk around the shore, and you had a whole adventure plan where they had to take a boat across, and you say, no, you can't walk around the shore, you have to take the boat, because I planned you to take the boat. That's railroading. It's not railroading when, like, them getting from point A to point B, like, that's fine. That's like, yes, nothing happens till they get to point A, but
I actually, my favorite example, and I've brought this up so many times with Monty. Monty knows that I talk about this reference a lot, is Deus Ex. The Deus Ex games, like Human Revolution, technically that's a linear game, but it's the way that you should run a linear campaign, where you say, here's your goal. Your goal in a Deus Ex mission, it's like, here's your mission. we're going to drop you off here and you need to get to that building and de-escalate the situation happening at the top with this bad guy. So you get dropped in, and from there you get to choose. It's like, oh, cool, I could sneak into the vents, or I could grab that gun and start blasting my way through it, or I could, hack my way around. Like there's choices, and the player gets to make those choices, but they're still following a progression that is presented to them, which is different than a game like Assassin's Creed or, Breath of the Wild, where it's just like, here's the world, go and do anything. And so a lot of people make the mistake of calling the linear storyline railroading, but a railroaded story, which in video games isn't a bad thing, but in D&D is. But I would say something like, well, even The Last of Us isn't really railroaded. But you're following a narrative, and if you're following that narrative, then it's fine. And I do want to mention, just, should I have a BBEG in mind, or can I let my players pursue certain goals without a central villain? That does depend on your campaign. Drakkenheim is a prime example of not having a BBEG as a central villain. The players created the villains in that campaign by choosing. But if you're running a campaign like something that's more similar to Horde of the Dragon Queen, the Cult of Dragons is the villain, and Severin is the BBEG, and Tiamat is the BBEG. And that's just the way it is. And it depends on the type of campaign you're running. Is it an open-ended campaign? Then let your players make the villain.
Yeah, and sometimes the only flip side of that is when consequences happen. Because sometimes the players always have a choice, but sometimes their choices lead to consequences. And those consequences are things that must be dealt with. And so that's when it really becomes something else. Right? Yeah. I think of the several sessions of very difficult negotiations in Drakkenheim, where it was the consequences felt like an iron grip. And I've even gotten comments where it's like, Monty was really railroading you guys. I was like, that was not in my opinion, that was not railroading. That was letting the consequences show how much muscle they have. Because sometimes the consequences of our decisions can feel like they are strangling us. And that is an important, that if you want to give the players freedom of choice, if you want to give the players agency, sometimes the players make the wrong choice, and sometimes they make bad choices, and sometimes they make mistakes. And they should, in fact. And hopefully they do. I hope they do. And when they do, that's when you can actually make the consequences really tough. And that's the flip side to freedom, right? If you want to have a campaign where the players can go and murder any NPC that they want to, well, the flip side of that is that now the elite bounty hunters are going to come after them and arrest them. And that's going to feel pretty railroady, but the players made that bed.
And I mean, honestly, if anybody says that Monty railroaded us as a player, I felt the opposite of railroaded to Drakkenheim. At some points I was like, what the heck do we do? There are so many choices laid out before us, and I'm so afraid of all of them. And that's not railroading. Drakkenheim is nothing if not a series of events leading to the consequence of our actions, in large and horrible ways. And so do you need a BBEG in mind? No. If you're running a campaign that has one, then present it as early as you feel is necessary once your characters fall in love with it. And, player choice is always going to be important, and you should design a campaign where even if you're playing a linear story, let your players choose. A linear story can be something as simple as an NPC says, listen, here's the mission, gang. We're going to break into this place and steal the something or other. That's a linear goal. Then you turn it to the players. How are we going to do that? And one of them will say, are there sewers that lead under the building? Another one will say, can we fly in? And they'll give you all these ideas. And now you get to decide with the players what path it's going to take. And then it goes from there.
Yeah, and sometimes you can give the players hard choices. You can give them choices that feel black and white. give them choices that feel binary. It's like you can give the players a choice that's like you either choose this person as your ally or this person as your ally, and the person that you don't choose is going to become your enemy, because that's the stakes of it, and because that stuff happens in real life, right? And as long as you've communicated to the players the reason why those things are those kind of hard choices, because one of the things that I this is just again my like opinion sort of thing, is like I do think that like a lot of our open world, open-ended video games have kind of created this impression that in an open world game, the players can do anything and they can win everything. Like in Skyrim, you can be the Archmage, Assassin Lord, Thief Guild leader, Fighters Guild head, who is also the king and the Dragonborn. And like, I personally think Skyrim would be like, and the Elder Scrolls games would be way more interesting if you actually had to decide. Like, one of the things that I love about Fallout New Vegas is that no, you can't negotiate an alliance between Caesar's Legion and the NCR. They're enemies. They are going to war with each other. You can decide what side of that war you want to be on, but there is no middle ground between those two factions, and that makes the game would not be as good, in my opinion, if like the middle ground, of course, is that you can make New Vegas independent, but Fallout New Vegas doesn't give you the ability to, at least not that I know of, to make an alliance between the NCR and the Caesar's Legion. No, I don't think it lets you do that. They're too ideologically opposed. And those ideological oppositions are interesting and cool and should be embraced, right? Sometimes hard choices happen to us in life. Crossroads happen to us in life. Not every decision, there's not an easy middle road to walk. The middle road should actually be the hardest road to walk.
I want to bring up, just make sure we're moving along here with Preston Cure's question. Any tips in mid to late campaigns to prep adventures without railroading? There are 5 or 6 hooks for the PCs to choose from, and I'd rather not prepare all 5 adventures ahead of time, yet I would like to give them complete freedom. So this is actually, I'm going to quickly answer this by relating it back to points we made earlier. Again, to not railroad them, I would write the first session of each of the 5 or 6 hooks. I would write whatever the first session would be for all of them, so that if they pick one, you have the first session prepared, and then have point form notes for the rest. And this is kind of also involved in player choice. If the players are going to have multiple choices in front of them, prepare a concept for all of the choices. Let the players choose, and then get to work. Now you've already given yourself a head time. If you've written the first session or 2 of each of those choices, then you have 2 sessions to figure out what the rest of it is. And if you need an extra week, Monty's done this before. Monty's been like, I need a week to figure out some Drakenheim stuff. It happens where you just need to prepare what's coming. And you need to tell your players like, okay, cool, you've chosen that. We'll play next session, and then we might take a week off, and then we'll move on from there. But prepare the beginning, don't prepare the whole thing, and let your players choose.
Yeah. Michael E. asked, when planning a campaign, how much thought should one give to sequencing encounters that are battle heavy and battle light? I'm planning my first longer campaign and want to make sure things keep exciting without wearing down the dice, allowing for some real roleplay while giving players the chance to flex their muscles. The first thing that I would say is that awesome roleplaying happens in battle. The story does not stop because swords are drawn. That is one of my favorite sayings, and sometimes the story moves like lightning in the midst of battle. That's what makes it cool. So there's lots of ways to make sure that those things are actually merged together. I think the answer to this question actually depends on the tastes of your players, though. I find that for my group, Kelly, Jill, and Joe, these guys can handle like one game session in 12. We'll have a game session that is all talk and is all role playing, and that's enough. And then otherwise, these guys want to have like 1 or 2 really good pieces of action every game session, right? Sometimes I can get away with like a game session where it's like half chatter and the second half the action starts is like the intro. But like I can have like maybe 1 in 20 sessions that is all chatter, and that's the pace that my group likes. Find out what the pace is that your group likes, and that will be the best way to find out. But always remember that your encounters should be building on your story in interesting ways. The combat encounter that we had last night in Shadows of Drakenheim was a really important story. Actually, it was a choice. There was story. All of that was involved. It was a scenario. What are you going to do? Who are you going to side with? How are you going to navigate the situation? It had action, story, consequences, choices, all firing at the same time. Takes a little bit of work, and I will say, I let that happen because they rolled a 6 and a 1. So that was also an improvised kind of thing too. So yeah, there you go.
So yeah, moving on to episodic campaigns / one-shots and preparing those. We have questions from Riley W., David M., and Dan the GW. So we'll start with Riley W. Do you approach campaign planning for episodic campaigns and epic campaigns differently? I think of episodic as something like the MCU movies, different stories featuring the same characters over time, whereas an epic campaign would be something more like Lord of the Rings, a single story goal tying together all of the adventures. And yeah, there is different ways to write these. And Monty, I'll let you go ahead first if you have any thought on that.
I think with episodic campaigns, and David M asks as well, like advice for planning episodic serialized ones where like your group doesn't get together on a regular basis. I personally think that if you, and this actually fills into Dan the GW's question of how do I design a one-shot campaign, or what is the best published D&D campaign for one-shot inspiration? And I will actually say there are some real gems in the Adventurers League modules. There's some real duds there, but there's some real gems there as well. And because the Adventurers League modules are available online through the Dungeon Masters Guild, and they're usually like $1 or $2, and many of them are trilogies, and they kind of have this loose structure anyways. The D&D Adventurers League, even if you don't like the rules of the D&D Adventurers League, you can still use the adventures. And many of the adventures are quite good, and all of them are built around being something that can be accomplished and introduced in 4 hours. So, well, I think, me personally, I kind of feel the quality of the adventures has been not as high most recently as it has been in the past. I was no offense to any of the writers or anything like that. I have actually found them some of the more recent ones are a little bit harder to run than some of the earlier ones are. So if you look at the Adventurers League adventures from season 1 and 2 and 5 and 6, they're actually very open-ended and really, really excellent. There's some really awesome ones like there's some really awesome ones in the Storm King's Thunder season that can be run in like 2 or 3 hours and are actually super open-ended and perfect for a one-shot. So I would recommend checking those out first. The ones that have come out more recently for Waterdeep Dragon Heist and Descent into Avernus have been really leaning into this trilogy model, which you may or may not like. And so, but fortunately, there's lots of reviews on the Dungeon Masters Guild, so there's lots of resources on how to run these ones and which ones are best for you and which ones are right for you. So that would be my first recommendation. The other one as well, the CCC adventures, which are the convention-created adventures on the Dungeon Masters Guild, these ones are all designed to be played at game conventions, which aren't happening right now, but they're built around this model of being really easy to run at a convention, which means that they provide a lot of great detail that is easy to run at a game table. And so you can take these as a structure and use them in an episodic way. And in fact, many of these ones are loosely connected. Like all of the adventures that are set in like season 2 are all set around like the city of Flan and like have links into like the bigger published campaigns as well. They're really cool, and it's really well designed actually. So for those of you interested in episodic stuff, Adventurers League is actually a thing to check out. Even if you don't run actual Adventurers League, the adventures themselves are great.
My 2 cents about running episodic campaigns is actually I took a lot of notes and I learned a lot of lessons from running Monster of the Week, which is an entire RPG system designed around episodic ideas. And the main lesson that I took from Monster of the Week is if you're setting out to design a campaign yourself, and you don't want to use the Adventures League stuff because you want to design your own campaign, have your players be a team of some sort, a team that is established. And that's what Monster of the Week does. It's like you are monster hunters. You are an organization. You're the Fighters Guild. You're the Assassins Guild, like something. You are the team already. And then all that you have to do from there is every time that you are able to get together to play, if you're doing an episodic campaign, you have a prominent NPC who's like the leader of that group, and they slap the file down on the table and say, all right, tonight we're dealing with this issue. This is the issue that's been handed to our group, our team. We have to go and take care of it. And this theme is very much like episodic TV shows, episodic movies. Like Mission Impossible is a great example. Every movie is a very different mission, and they go and they have to do different things, and it's the same team of people, and it's like your mission if you choose to accept it. So take that model if you're planning an episodic campaign. Your players are a team, they're an organization of some sort, and you're just going to give them the mission of the week when they sit down to play.
Awesome. So now we're moving into some world building questions. Andrew T is asking a really big question, but one that I have a couple quick answers for, which is how do you create an active religion for your world? And I want to start off by acknowledging that actually making a religion is different from making a cosmology and making a pantheon, because generally speaking, when we think of religions, when D&D's default assumption is that the gods are real and that the gods manifest in the world and talk to their followers. Whereas I think, and that lends itself well to pantheons and priests, but less so to religions, because religions tend to have things like dogma, hierarchies, and they're one of the beautiful things about religions is that there tends to be a lot of them, and they tend to all have different points of view. When you want to make a religion for your D&D world, though, there's a couple things that I think are really good to answer. The first thing is, how was the world created? That is usually one of the first things that religions talk about, is how the world was made. The second thing that most religions also address are what happens when you die. And so religions will have an answer for that. And then the third thing that most religions have are what are the 5 to 10 or 12 things that you need to know to live a good life. And so if you look at a lot of real world religions, they usually have things like the 10 Commandments or a 5-step plan or the 12 steps or something like that, or like the path, the way, and the light. And they tend to be like 5 really digestible mantras that define morality, ethics, and expectations for the followers. And these things can be everything from don't kill people to make sure that you always pray every day at 6:00 p.m. while you are facing a tree as the sun is going down underneath the clouds. So like religions usually have a balance of like quirky specific things that are rituals that are performed to show faith, and pretty good moral frameworks. And so those are a couple like really high level steps for doing things, and a great starting point for your fantasy religion. The other thing that most religions usually most religions also have a prophet or several prophets, particularly in the real world. And oftentimes a lot of religions usually have a martyr of some kind, so like whether it's someone who died for the religion in some way. If you look at basically this idea of monomyth, that is basically that that is, or the hero's journey. It is this whole idea that there was a hero or martyr figure of some kind who sacrificed their life so that we could have knowledge that would guide us to either enlightenment or the afterlife or purity or whatever. So these ideas, often will result. You can very easily get a religion that feels like it's Christianity by following these steps, but I would actually look at non-Christian religions as well and see how they work, and take caution, be respectful of other cultures as you do this, but studying real-world religions is a great way to get inspiration as well for how you can do things a little bit differently. So
Everett Patterson, I'm going to sum up their question here. How do you handle the assumption that the world is ancient, combined with that adventures should have a clear focus on the present? And how do you reconcile these two elements? How does a DM suggest a layered history or create a mood without getting too bogged down? And actually, I'm going to pull on one of Monty's recent adventure hooks in Shadows of Drakenheim for this. But if you're creating a location, simply decide what the location was when it was first built. And then, once you have that decided, figure out what it is now and include elements of both of those. For example, if you find an old tower in the swamp that was an ancient elven tower, there are going to be elements in there of what the tower was originally, but the players, you don't need to know the entire history. Even when somebody who spoke fluid Elven tried to decipher the exact messages that this tower was depicting, it was ancient enough that they couldn't quite place their finger on it. And that's okay. That means that you don't have to write an entire history of the location. You're just saying, this is an ancient temple used to bury the dead. It was elven in design. Now it's being used as a horrible nest of monsters. And throughout the adventure, pepper in those elements of both of those facts. And now you've created the world is ancient, but you're also dealing with the present.
Yeah, and I would say as well, people don't often have a very good grasp of history and how old things are. And so you can kind of say this was made in the past without knowing how long ago it actually was. I only recently came up with the timeline for the world of Drakenheim, and that timeline actually only goes back about 750 years. I find timelines that operate on thousands of years scale difficult to believe, because I think that at least humans don't have a very long memory. Elves and dwarves and dragons can be different, but humans tend to forget what happened yesterday. Noah Harris asks, how do you prepare a city? If you aren't sure what your players will do and where they'll go, how do you make sure to create enough interesting NPCs to encounter without burning yourself out? You need 10. 10. Who is in charge of the city administration? Who is the highest religious authority? Who is the highest magical authority? Who is the most economically prominent citizen? And who is in charge of law and order? Those are 5. Those are the 5 leader people in the city. Then have an innkeeper, a shopkeeper, and 3 regular folks that are associated with what you think are the most important other places. I personally have been operating most recently on a model of I make 1 tavern per 10,000 people in the city. And I only come up with the name and who runs it at first. And then I figure it out from there once my players actually go there.
Yeah. So something that I know both Monty and I do when we're creating a city, and Drakenheim is an exception. Drakenheim is a dungeon that is a city. It's an entire campaign. But if you're just designing a city like the cities we're seeing in Shadows, where it's more like the players are visiting and exploring a bit of it, what you do is you look at a map of a city, find a D&D city map, break it into districts, decide what each district specializes in, what is the district's purpose, and then create those 10 NPCs and place them in the districts. And very simply from there, you have it fleshed out enough that you can just, if a player's walk through a district, explain what is happening there.
Yeah. With this districts thing, if you really want my secret, play Civilization 6 and learn how the district system in that game works. Basically, the rule with Civilization 6 is that the city has a city center, and it can have these different districts of different kinds depending on how big the city is. So a city that has a population of 10 in the abstract nature of Civilization can have 4 districts. And the districts in Civilization are the theater or cultural district, the market commerce district, the harbor district, the military district, the religious district, the educational district, the entertainment district, and then most recently, like, there's like the spaceport district, the government district. So like, actually, just like, if you haven't played Civ 6, it's awesome, and it'll teach you a lot about like world building. It's great. It's a great game for DMs to play to get ideas of like how to build a world. And like, you can basically steal the districts that Civ uses and even the buildings that you can build in Civ, and that will tell you, oh, this is actually what a city needs.
I did see somebody ask, like, should we have 5 NPCs for each district? The answer is no, you don't need that. Just have all the districts and have some of your common NPCs. Somebody also wrote that like gossipers is a form of NPC. Like have an NPC that's just a gossiper, and they can be wherever the players go. If they go to a tavern in the rich part of the city or the poor part of the city, just take your gossiper NPC and place them in that tavern.
Yep. And Skyrim is actually a really useful one for seeing how cities are organized too, because all the cities in Skyrim are led by a Jarl. All the Jarls have a steward and a court mage and like a knight. So like basically a ruler has a staff of like a priest, a mage, a knight. Like essentially a ruler has a rogue, a cleric, a wizard, and a fighter. Right? So there's like an adventuring party advising every ruler. And that's a great way to like conceptualize your world building.
What do we got next? Did we answer Colton P question here?
How do you manage to, Colton P asked, how do you manage, or Marowak asks, how do you manage to simulate an open world feel without adding too many things into the campaign? Sometimes you just throw stuff away. You just throw it out into the world and see what sticks, right? Like sometimes you make an offhand reference to turtles swimming through your lake, and that gets picked up and people love it. This is a really, you make your list, and sometimes you just throw out casual references and see what sticks, and be prepared to improvise when your players decide to investigate that. In many ways, world building, making a world feel open, is actually like making a Hollywood movie set or a iceberg. So when you go to a Hollywood set, like the classic Western movie set, where it actually turns out that the fronts of those buildings is just a painted facade and there's no actual building there. And that's the same as an iceberg. That's the inverse of an iceberg, actually. Like an iceberg just shows you the tip of the iceberg, and there's this giant thing underneath the surface of the water. Don't be like an iceberg. Be like Hollywood. Paint the front facade, and that will make your world seem really big, but you only actually have to decide what's there when the camera goes there.
You're creating props, really, and then once the players decide to explore that prop, then you figure out what's happening behind the painted facade. You can say something very simple in your campaign, and if the players start to dig into it, this is a simple rule that I learned very quickly. I used to get stumped when a character would be like, "Oh, I've heard about that old place, that old house on the hill. It's haunted." And then the players go, "How long has it been haunted? What do you know about it?" And they start asking all these questions. And then I would go, "Oh no, I haven't prepared any of that." But instead, you could just have the NPC be like, "Oh, I don't know that much. I only know it's haunted." That's NPCs, having your NPC be the delivery of information means that your NPC can also be an idiot and not know things. And then the players are going to they're going to have to go explore, and that gives you time to come up with what the answer is. Somebody might point at the tavern and be like, "What's in that tavern?" And you can have the NPC be like, "Oh, I don't go to that tavern. I go to the one up the street." "Well, what's there?" "I don't know. They serve drinks." "Cool." Now, now you still don't know what's behind the door until the players decide to open the door, and then you have to make it up.
Yep. Moving on to our kind of miscellaneous grab bag of questions, and then we'll see if we can take a couple more questions if we have time. Samuel C wants to ask, I'm prepping Tomb of Annihilation, but I recently picked up Rime of the Frost Maiden, and I've been fantasizing about running Rime of the Frost Maiden, and I think I enjoy running both. How do I determine which module I should run? Ask your players. Straight up. Just ask your players. See which one they're more excited for. That's the best way.
When I started running Out of the Abyss, I placed, I was really excited to run Out of the Abyss, Curse of Strahd, or Tomb of Annihilation. And I placed all 3 books out. And I said, look at the covers of these books. I'm going to give you a quick pitch on each, like a 1 sentence. This one's about the Underdark. This one's a Gothic vampire module. And this one is a tromp through the jungle looking for an ancient tomb.
Yeah.
Which one sounds the most interesting? And my players all said, "Oh, Underdark sounds cool." And I went, "Okay, let's run Out of the Abyss." And I was happy with that because I couldn't really pick. I wanted to run all 3. I don't know which one I want to run the most. So I let the players tell me which one sounded the most exciting for them.
Yep. And the only thing I would tell them is the way to spin it so that the choice is a little bit more thought through is tell them about the Death Curse and Tomb of Annihilation, because that's like a big mechanical thing that isn't present in Rime of the Frost Maiden, and that might be the thing that switches them over. The Death Curse is really important to Tomb of Annihilation. Don't get rid of it. I think it actually is really important, having run the campaign. That would be one of the things that I would ask your players, like, do you guys want to do this Death Curse thing or not? Colton P also asks, do you have any thoughts or recommendations for running a futuristic sci-fi themed campaign? Not really, aside from don't play D&D. Definitely look at the sci-fi focused RPGs and consider those before give them a very fair consideration before you commit to running D&D with a sci-fi themed campaign.
This is a hard pill to swallow for some, and I actually had to learn this. It was a pretty hard lesson to learn because I wanted D&D to be everything. But D&D is a very specific thing, and it excels at being what it is. But there are so many other RPGs out there that are worth people's time to check out that excel at being what you want to play in your D&D setting. Everybody wants to run a futuristic or sci-fi themed campaign. We have things like Starfinder that can fill that gap. We have tons like, I tried to write, I think I've told the story a million times. I'll tell the short version here. I tried for a very long time to turn D&D into a horror cabin in the woods campaign, only to find Monster of the Week and realize that that's what I actually wanted to run the whole time. And It took me 2% of the work I was about to put in to re-rigging D&D to be what I... Don't try to fit D&D, the square box, into a circular hole when you can go check out the circular box that already fits.
Yeah. Unless you want to play Spelljammer.
It's fair,
yeah.
fair.
Yep. 3Jack Pete asked, what tools would you use to manage the intercession discussion and how would you approach it as a DM? We use Discord. It works great. Create a Discord channel or server for your group. It's perfect. We love it. We also communicate via Zoom. It works for us. Email sucks. Email is the worst. Facebook Messenger is the worst. Text messaging is the worst. I don't use it. We've tried. We had a Facebook chat once. We had a Facebook group actually once. Never worked. But for our group, Discord has seemed to work. I think that's probably because we have a nice Discord server for our patrons, and we have a private channel on that for just us that kind of keeps it all in one place. So like that works well for us. I've seen people create wikis and pages and stuff. That feels like a lot of work to me. A Google Doc though is actually another good thing to do too, and share that around.
Are we on to J Cruelty Catalog? Tips for dungeon masters on how to deal with players who get bogged down going off the beaten path literally for hours and hours without railroading them. Okay, I have a simple solution. This is a DM trick. Never tell your players. If I have a specific place that I want my players to go, and they have a tendency to go off the course, I will write a smaller event that ties to the event I want them to head towards. And if they go off the course, it's an event I can just plop in. It's like, oh, you're traveling into the woods instead of going to town. Here's a cabin in the woods where somebody really needs you to go to town to do something. And they'll still feel like they went into the woods and found something there. And then it steered them back. You can actually very craftily course correct your players without them knowing that you've corrected them. And this isn't railroading. You're just adding bits to the adventure that tie into the main plot that steer them back towards what you wanted them to accomplish in the first place.
In a similar vein to this, one of the issues when players get bogged down going off the beaten path, usually they're searching for something. Give it to them. And don't bog down your game by making it hard for them to get what they want. If your players have gone down the beaten path because, like, for some weird reason, they've got it in their mind that they need to get, like, a cleric of Joaquin to help them with their quest. And you're like, there's not any clerics of Joaquin in this city. What are you doing? Just put one in. just make it easy. Like, just stop dragging it out. Right? You are in control. You're in way more control than you think they are. If they're going down the beaten path, off the beaten path, then the simple way to get them back onto the main track is they went off the path for a reason. Why? So they went off that reason they were looking for something. So rather than dragging them on a wild goose chase on the beaten path and making it and trying to put together an adventure around them going off the beaten path, just give them what they were looking for, get them back on it. Just, and that way they got the thing. And, the cleric of Joaquin or maybe they were looking for like a magic sword or a magic item. You don't have to give them 100% of what they were looking for. You can kind of dial it back and be like, yeah, this cleric of Joaquin is level 5, not level 10. And so they can help you, but not as much as you wanted them, and be like, okay, that's great. And that will probably get them back into it.
Tony Jones asks, a good campaign will have challenging encounters, and there's always the chance of a total party kill. Do you make contingency plans for that? In season 1 of Drakkenheim, it appeared you had. I'm going to tell you right now, and I think Monty can agree with me on this. Total party kill is boring for me as a DM. I do not like it. It's not my favorite thing. Sometimes in rare occurrences, yes, it is the only choice if things go really, really sideways. But actually, something that I loved in Out of the Abyss was there's a group of Drow that are chasing the party right from the beginning. And it even says in there, like, if the party total party kills, have them wake up back in the prison with the Drow. And it's just one of those things that it's like, if your enemies have a reason to keep them alive, and like even a monster might drag them back to its lair to store for future eating while it eats like an NPC, and you get to do the Luke Skywalker frozen up by his feet in the tunnel escape scene rather than the Luke Skywalker just got killed because he's an idiot scene. So there's always a more fun option, and I don't care what anybody says. There's a lot of times where people are like, I would just kill my party. Yeah. I don't want to. I want there to be consequences, and I want to keep the players alive because it's more exciting for me. It's more exciting for them. I will kill a single player if it's appropriate, but a total party kill usually means that I feel like I've done something wrong as a DM, or the players have made horrible, horrible choices. Yeah. In which case I want them to feel the consequences by surviving and having to deal with it.
A total party kill should feel like a satisfying ending to the campaign. And if a total party kill is not going to create a satisfying ending to the campaign, it's time to pull out the emergency stops. We get a lot of comments on several specific episodes of Drakkenheim of why didn't you TPK the party for this? And my answer is simple. Well, then the campaign would have been over and the live stream would have been over. And so I made the decision as the dungeon master because, first of all, I wanted to keep my live stream campaign going because I'm liking it and I'm enjoying it. And so I came up with other interesting consequences for that. The player's survival is often one of the least interesting stakes that you can have in a campaign. If your stakes are bigger than the player's survival, at least from moment to moment, then you kind of free yourself from that. And so, well, yes, there's always the chance of an individual character dying, but a total party kill should be tricky. And I think, the tricky thing, particularly for my group, is that we have 3 players. So it can really, if one person were to die, it can really go into an out of control scenario. And so we did have contingencies for that. And part of the reason, again, why we had contingencies is because we're live streaming. And so if I have a total party kill, then I have a really, really stressful work week ahead of me of figuring out what I'm going to do. For the next live stream. And also, like, if we have a total party kill an hour into the stream, do we end? Like, what do we do? Right. So there's a couple things where, like, I'm kind of like doing some DM foo behind the stream because I'm a streamer, and there's a set of different constraints there. If your campaign has a total party kill, so be it. And I kind of had that mentality for a very long time before I started streaming. And now my mentality's kind of shifted a little bit, and I try to think of things that are more interesting to me, at least. And so, yeah, I could have killed my players several times in Dungeons of Drakkenheim. There were several things that were basically TPKs in that campaign, but we kept the campaign going, and it continued an interesting story. So that's my answer to it.
If you guys, all I'm going to say here is the riddle. If you guys remember the riddle, if you don't think that we as players didn't feel like that was a total party kill and we just had to start from scratch again, you're wrong. Like, the consequences of that situation were traumatic enough for our players that it didn't matter that we didn't get total party killed. We had to deal with that for the rest of the campaign. The situation that occurred afterwards was a statement, and like, it took us a long time to get our stuff back.
Yeah.
And I mean, there were things lost that we never got back.
Yep.
That were very important.
And there were consequences beyond just the things, right? It set the whole tone for the negotiation that you had with that character, right?
A horrible defeat is as good, if not better, than a total party kill.
Yep. Peter J asks, how many random encounters do you have planned and ready to go when you play? For myself, usually 1 or 2. Kelly?
Oh, wow. Here's me over planning. I didn't know that Monty only had 1 or 2 until this very moment. I for my campaign, each region has a list of about 12 random encounter options, ranked from the one that I think is most important to the one that I think is just kind of fun and flavorful. And if my players run into a random encounter, I will grab one near the top and then work my way down.
But I'm also confident in my ability to build encounters on the fly, right? Like, so I like, Kelly knows that I usually, when we play in real life, I have the shelf of miniatures set out beside me, and I have like my ready reach of Dwarven Forge stuff. What Kelly doesn't, Kelly can't see that now because we're playing on Roll20, but on Roll20, I have a whole page of Roll20 where I've laid out like different groups of monster tokens that I can just copy and paste. And I have about 40 maps preloaded into Roll20 that I can, like, I have like 5 different maps that are like generic city streets or generic buildings or generic countryside locations or like things that are kind of relevant that I might use. And that just lets me go to those locations as I need them. That's one of the great things actually about running the game online, is that like I've been able to build this library of maps and this library of monster tokens and everything that is way bigger and actually faster to set up than any of my Dwarven Forge setups ever could have been. in real life. So that'll be an interesting thing to get used to when finally all this, the world goes back to a semblance of normal and we can play together in person again.
I do want to quickly answer a question in the chat because it's very relevant to the current conversation. Session Zero Clothing says, do those random encounters have ties to the main story, or are they just actually random? The trick with random encounters is I try to make as many of them as possible tie to one of the major plots happening in the story. The only time that it will be truly random, the only other thing I will do if you're doing a vast world, is have occasionally random encounters that are tied to the area.
Yeah.
So like if you're in the woods, a random encounter might be an owl bear den, but it might also be a group of bandits that are tied to the bandit camp just outside the woods.
I will say that I tend to try to always make my random encounters further the plot in some way, and more increasingly, I try to include key NPCs in my random encounters. Like, one of the things that I love about Curse of Strahd is that Strahd is on the random encounter table, and that's great in my opinion. Putting the key villains and those key characters that you've created as, yeah, there's just a chance that they show up. Love it. We are getting close to 8 o'clock, but I'm okay to extend our time a little bit so we can finish these questions up and answer a couple chat questions. What do you think, Kelly?
I could do a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, like 10, 15 minutes over? Yeah, okay.
This one's kind of strange from Walt F. I noticed that Monty doesn't tend to use too many of the skill check chase scenes, types of encounters that I see in other campaigns or adventures. What's the reasoning for not using any of these, and what's the guidance on building these types of fast-paced encounters? My truth is, I kind of hate skill checks. I find them a little bit binary, and I tend to have a very like narrative fail forward sort of approach for this stuff, and yeah,
I love your chase scenes.
Yeah, I love my chase scenes too, but I struggle to explain exactly what I'm doing in those ones and why I don't use these I don't use them very often because they're hard to run. And my guidance on building these ones is to like, kind of is really to make them last exactly 5 rounds. Regardless of what happens, make them over in 5 rounds. And don't track the exact speed of how fast it's moving. Like, it's over in 5 rounds, and that way it stays like kind of contained and it feels fast paced, rather than it being like, we moved 100 feet, we moved 100 feet, we moved 100 feet. That's kind of the way that I do it. I think that's my best bit of advice for that.
I'm still trying to figure out how to run a good chase scene from Monty, so I don't have much input on that, unfortunately. Yeah. Colton P asks, this one's actually a tough one.
And this one's actually in chat now too, because Lord Samuel asked a similar question about how do you plan for tier 4 and high level campaigns?
It's tough.
It's tough.
How do you continue to challenge your players? You do need different expectations. You need to design encounters differently. You need to take into account things outside of just the monster that are going to affect the battlefield. You need to have stakes that are larger during a battle. I find that like it's hard to challenge the players with monsters alone.
Yeah.
But to have the monsters threatening a situation where like they're going to destroy a major city, or prominent NPCs are going to die for every round that they don't kill the monster, terrible things are going to happen. These are the sorts of things that allow you to drive a higher end campaign further. So start thinking outside of just the battle with the monsters and start thinking about what's at stake in those situations, and have the players have to do something. If the players are having to rescue people while fighting a monster, while there's explosions going off and buildings on fire, then you've created a different situation that's more intense, no matter how high level the party is.
The other thing is, I think for high level D&D, draw inspiration from modern real world crises, because modern real world crises tend to have earth-shattering consequences in a way that that is actually quite relevant for high level characters. And think about things in modern storytelling things. In the modern age, we can jet set across the world. We can go to space if we have to. You know, we can have stories where characters go to space, and we have instant worldwide communication and mass surveillance. One of the biggest elements of problems in the modern age is information warfare. Who knows? Who's watching? Who's spying? What do high-level characters have in D&D? Scrying, contact other plane, demi-plane. They have magical safe deposit boxes. Get inspired by the dark dealings of modern conspiracy theories and modern mega corporations and governments, and get really dark with it. A great, all that batshit conspiracy theory stuff that is in the world today, in your D&D world, pretend it's true. And take it to its logical, fantastic conclusion by adding, maybe the moon really is hollow and lizard people are living inside it, controlling our minds. That sounds like a great high-level D&D campaign to me, right? And so that kind of gonzo, borderline crazy stuff actually works a lot for high-level D&D, especially when you want to threaten the world in a strange and esoteric sort of way. And so we can get that cool stuff happening. Very much, for me, the Amethyst Academy in my worlds in the Drakenheim campaign is basically me saying, what if we ran a mage guild the way that modern corporations run? Right. And I'm really excited about actually doing high level play with Adam Amethyst Academy stuff, because then I get to just show you just how my council, my high archmage council is, I have a list of some really dastardly CEOs that I'm drawing inspiration on for these people. So
it looks like we only have 2 questions left. Charles A. Sams asks, how do you handle magic items for low level, just starting out characters? I've just started running a game where characters starting at first level. I want magic items to be rare or special, but I also don't want to set the party up for failure. I try to let magic items be a bonus, not something that is essential for the party to succeed, unless it's a plot device.
Yep.
But when your characters are just starting, let them level up without magic items for a while. I usually don't give out my first magic items till level 4 or 5.
Aside from potions and scrolls and consumables.
Consumables, yeah. Consumables, potions, and scrolls are good for anything, but don't set up anything crazy that requires any magic items, and let the magic items fall into place loosely. We're actually doing a lot of magic item videos in the future. We did one recently, and we plan to do more for the other classes. And the idea behind those magic item videos is we actually recommend what levels you should give certain rarities. I don't remember off the top of my head, but
the rule of thumb is each player character should find 1 magic item of each rarity, which means that which means that when you do that, a player character basically gets a new magic item once every 4 or 5 levels, which means that you're actually giving out 1 magic item per character level if you've got a party of 4. So that's a weird, quick math version of doing it. But oftentimes, you rejigger that, because usually what you want to do is at some point in the campaign, you want all the player characters to find 1 magic item at once, because that feels good. And you can give out more or less than that, but I usually tend to do my kind of model for my campaigns is over the course of the whole campaign, 2 uncommons, 2 rares, 1 very rare, and 1 legendary, and with a couple wild cards thrown in to have some fun. So that feels right to me.
Last question from our Patreon. Timberwolf asks, have we seen a permanent move towards an increase in online play? Probably.
I think 100%.
I think that after COVID is done, there will still be a lot of people who have realized the joys of being able to play with anybody from anywhere from online. I still personally am excited to get back to the basement with my friends, but we have realized that we are now much more open to play with people elsewhere in the world because of our capabilities with online play.
Yeah.
So with that, unless you had anything to add, I think we can open it up to
I think we can
questions from
spend
the
like another
chat.
15 minutes taking some questions. Please type question in capital letters if you have a question for us. We'll try to answer as many as we can with the time that we have remaining. We do have one up here from P Falcon 7777 of how much work do you think it will be to run two of the same campaign for two different groups at the same time? That sounds scary to me.
My problem is
also weirdly doable.
It's both better and worse. It's better because you already have everything prepped. It's worse because players are going to do vastly different things, and trying to keep notes on each of them could get confusing. So as long as you're confident, I would say, in being able to separate the two groups and not confuse any plot points, then you might be okay.
Matthew Raccoon asks, any thought on Wes March's style campaigns? So Wes March's style campaigns, yeah, I have a thought on them. Here's my thought. I think Wes March's style campaigns are highly aspirational, and I would love to hear from someone who has actually run one successfully long term, because I think that it's kind of a legend that a Wes March's campaign has happened. The idea behind a Wes March's campaign is you have this really like large area that the players can explore, and you have like a stable of like 12 to 18 players that like each week they come out and they meet, and like 5 of them ring up the dungeon master and say, hey, we're gonna go explore this area this week, and then you do like a bunch of one shots. I think that like maybe the person who wrote the original Wes March's article, I think that was like a once in a lifetime thing that they pulled that off. And I would love to hear from somebody who has actually successfully run a Wes March's style campaign with 12 or more players on a long-term basis, because that sounds like a total fantasy to me. It sounds like a beautiful fantasy, but it sounds like a fantasy. I think it's very aspirational. And I worry that the idea of a Wes March's campaign is very seductive, and the actuality of it is a lot more problematic. I think a lot of people have recommended Wes March's style campaigns, and they've never actually successfully run one. I've never run a Wes March's campaign. I love the idea of it. I actually was invited to play in a Wes March's campaign once that was run by someone here in Toronto. It lasted 2 sessions and then it collapsed. So let's be realistic.
I'm going to answer. Benno123T has asked this, and I actually saw this pop up several times. When will you return to Dungeons of Drakkenheim? So let me clear this one up. Dungeons of Drakkenheim was the name of season 1 of our campaign, which has concluded at episode 52. That will forever be Dungeons of Drakkenheim. We have currently moved on to season 2, Shadows of Drakkenheim, which does take place in the same world, ties into the events of season 1, but is from the perspective of 3 different characters, but there will be multiple references to the things that are happening in season 1, Dungeons of Drakkenheim. Monty and I, and this is something that I will say very loosely because we have to see how Shadows goes, but we do plan to eventually return to the characters in Drakkenheim and see what's going on there. What that looks like yet, we have to wait until the end of season 2. So if the question that you're asking is when will we return specifically to Dungeons of Drakkenheim, I have to say never. But if your question is when are we going to see what's happening with the characters from that season, the answer is eventually, but we have another story that we want to tell first, and that is what we're currently doing in season 2. But they all are connected to one overarching plot line.
Cool. She-Wolf 1310 asks, to follow up on a bit of character backstory, what would you recommend for pacing? Or is it more important to let the players decide by their actions in game? I think that the sooner you get the player characters involved in elements of their backstory, the better. Don't hold back. And also, I definitely think that players tend to want to have epic backstories, and they tend to imagine their characters' plot lines having epic conclusions, and rather than small, like, baby steps that can be started early on. I try to encourage my players to come up with backstory elements that can actually be resolved at very low levels in very interesting ways. And that way they can evolve over time. The main thing that I like to remind my players is don't make the most interesting thing about your character something that happened in their backstory. They should have a more interesting future ahead of them that we can discover. And at that point, I like to sprinkle it in. I like to have the character's backstory feel very present.
We also have a question here. I have an entire world. This is from Confident Rabbit. I have an entire world that I've written, my first one. Any suggestions for writing a good villain? We kind of covered that in the discussion on villains, but to reiterate the quick points here for you, I would say that when you're writing a villain, write them the same way that you would a player character, with goals, ideals, bonds, and flaws. Write them in a way that they have a well thought out purpose and ways to accomplish their goals, and do not make them have endless resources.
And a plan, but they have a plan.
Yeah.
Draven Dresden asks, what would you say to a wizard player who's the only PC that has never gotten a magic item? I would tell you, if you're looking for recommendations, we just did a video on our favorite magic items for sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards, and we have recommendations for all levels of play. So check that out. It's on YouTube. It's a great one if you're looking for recommendations for how to power up your wizard PC with a good bit of stuff in there.
Rebel 2188, what is the best way to run a large-scale battle scenario with lots of different types of monsters or enemies?
Break it into smaller parts. I am personally break it into smaller parts, and if you wanted to do a mass battle, play Warhammer. With all play a game of Warhammer, but break it into smaller parts, break it into smaller scenes. The Red Hand of Doom, the climax of the Red Hand of Doom adventure actually is a great way of showing how to do this, of having several hot spots in the battle that the players can go to where their actions influence the battle, and then it actually turns the mass battle into a 5-room dungeon. So run your mass battle as a 5-room dungeon with 5 big problems that happen on the battlefield. The players can decide what order they go into them is. Just turn it into a dungeon. It actually works really, really well.
If you're running a mass combat, I want you guys to keep in mind, like, I love referencing movies and cinema, but in every war scene in a movie, in every like medieval war scene, the two main characters, the main bad guy and the main good guy, meet on the battlefield, and suddenly they're fighting, and all of the other troops are for some reason ignoring them, and there's now this circle that's formed around them while this war is raging behind them. Just make the war rage behind them, but have the party deal with group after group in these small pockets within a war scene. It's a really cool way to do it, and it works.
Yep.
We only have time for a couple more. Because I will have to get going pretty soon.
Yeah.
Over What the Heck asks question, I love you. Answer, I love you too.
Zolvar asks, if I want to get into live streaming D&D sessions here on Twitch, what should be my priorities? You need to decide what your priorities are. If you want to build an audience and build like a following, Twitch is the worst place to do it. It's really hard to grow on Twitch without a existing audience. We were doing content on YouTube for a year before we came onto Twitch, and that's how we developed our audience. So it can be a little bit of a challenge there. But the number one priority for any online content is you gotta have good audio. That's the number one thing. Good audio, and be authentically yourself. If you're live streaming with a group of players, make sure that everyone's got a good quality microphone. That's the number one thing that people complain about on our YouTube channel, is not our opinions. It's about our audio.
Still working on that. We're figuring it out. Yeah,
we've come a long way, but that's definitely the challenge.
We probably have time for like 1 or 2 more. Monty, what's a good one?
Okay, we got a few more here. Um, let's see. Um, is it? I like this. Is actually a very very good one, and I think it's an interesting one to think about. Is it better to scrap a new campaign if a player quits, or is it better to try to evolve around the absence?
Um, for me, I would say it depends how many players you have at the table. If Drakenheim, now Drakenheim's also streamed, but I think if we had a 3-player campaign and one person left, we would drop the campaign. Um, in my house campaign that I was running, we never made it to the end of Out of the Abyss. I ran most of Out of the Abyss, but Jill was playing in my home game, and she announced that she was pregnant, and her husband both played in my home game, and both departed because they were going to have too much on their plates. And with 2 of them leaving, that's when I said, you know what, guys, I think that's pretty much half the team. Let's just
Yeah.
scrap it and start something new.
Yeah, we're coming to a time where a lot of our close friends are having babies, and with and we had our home game, the boys' night that was our Sunday night game that we kept sacred for 5 years almost. We kind of have had that on hiatus because 2 of our players, few people have kids, few people are working on their decks and building their houses and all that good stuff, and so we've kind of had to put that one on hiatus, and it's been tough to keep the I do find that as Kelly and I have done more work as content creators and doing more streaming, it's keeping our home campaigns has up and the lights on those has been a challenge, especially as our players have had their own lives too. So it's been a tricky thing. I found that for many years I was able to keep campaigns going even though players were leaving because I had a really good and dedicated core. So it's not impossible to keep a campaign going even though a player leaves the campaign. And it really depends on what the rest of the players want to do too, and how everyone's commitment. Sometimes a player leaving your campaign can be the best thing that ever happened to it.
I think we are at about that time. I think we do have to wrap it up. I know that there's a lot of questions we didn't get to, but I do want to thank everybody for participating and hanging out with us. And
Yeah.
we're going to be doing another one of these next month. And if you want to submit your questions ahead of time, we definitely encourage you to join our Patreon if you can. You can join for as little as $1 a month. So if you buy coffee, you can buy Dungeon Dudes too.
Yeah, the videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our patrons. It really helps it, everything that we do here, to keep streaming. We had to get new gear and everything so that everyone could have a setup at home and keep doing that, and that would not have been possible without the support of our patrons. So a big thank you to all of you. I hope that you're satisfied with us as we got through all your questions. For those of you chiming in chat, my apologies to those of you who we couldn't get to your questions, but we will be doing this on a monthly basis, and we keep finding better ways to make sure that we can answer everyone's questions as we go through this as best we can. We had some pretty meaty ones this time.
Yeah.
And so hopefully there's some useful stuff in the midst of all this as well. A big thank you once again for all of you joining us tonight, to all of our patrons for all these awesome questions, and hopefully there's been some good advice in here.
Thank you guys so much, and stay tuned for more awesome episodes, more amazing episodes of Drakenheim, and we will see you guys next time in the dungeon.
You bet. Have a great night.